Hello, welcome to my second video about Germany. So this video, as you can see, it's about how the new Weimar government worked, how it was put together, the system, that kind of thing. Again, bad map, but I'm okay with it, so we'll go from here. So first thing you might notice about the government in Germany from 1919 onwards is that it's called the Weimar government, or sometimes it's called the Weimar Republic or Weimar Constitution. Well, Constitution just means the system or the way that the government is set up. So is it by voting? What kind of groups do you vote for? The council? Is it parliament? All of these kinds of things. And that's what constitution is. It's just the rules on how the system works. But where is Weimar? So if you look at my very badly drawn map here, I've tried to show you where Weimar is. Now, Berlin was the capital of Germany at the time, still is. But you'll notice Weimar is not in the same place as Berlin. And you might remember from my last video that I said Germany in 1918 is basically just a mess, which means that actually the government, when it was formed, Berlin was too dangerous for the government to sit and work there. So they decided to move to Weimar, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere in Germany, nowhere near as big and certainly not as violent as Berlin was at the end of the First World War. So that's why it's called the Weimar government, just to get that one out of the way. They do later move back to Berlin, and if you were to go and visit Berlin today, you can still go and visit the Reichstag building, which is where the Bundestag, is it the Bundestag? Yeah, the Bundestag, I think. Well, the Bundestag, which is the German government today, German parliament today, meets, but the Reichstag is the building. So this is a system that is set up in 1919. So I've kind of broken it down into this little diagram, which hopefully you can follow. You'll see at the top here, we've got the president, they're the head of state. Then we've got the government, which is made up of the chancellor and the cabinet. That's not dissimilar to British politics today, where we have the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. And the Cabinet is where you have ministers, like the Minister for Education or the Minister for Health or that kind of thing. So they're the ones who kind of make decisions, they run the country, that kind of thing. Then underneath we've got the Parliament. So they're the people, there are two houses actually of Parliament in Germany as well, the Reichstag and the Reichsrat. They have slightly different roles. The Reichstag is more important, but when it comes to making laws, it has to be passed through both of them, which is the same as the UK as well. So if a bill tries to become a law or an act of parliament, it has to be passed by both the House of Commons and the House of Lords in the UK. In Germany, in the Weimar Republic, Weimar government, it had to be passed by the Reichstag and the Reichsrat. Now at the bottom, I've written the word electorate. That just means the people who were voting, the people who could participate in elections. Now Germany is actually really forward thinking, because their electorate at this time in the Weimar government was anyone over the age of 21, whether they were a man or a woman. Now for those of you who know your history of the suffragists and the suffragettes, you know that's actually better than Britain by quite a bit. It's not until 1928 that Britain offers women the right to vote on the same footing as men. Germany, way ahead of the game in the Weimar government, the electorate, anyone, male or female, over the age of 21 can vote, which is brilliant. So this is how the system works. The electorate meets to vote every 4 years to vote for who they would like to be in the parliaments. And they vote every 7 years on who they would like the president to be. Now, president isn't a role that we have over here, so it might be a little bit confusing to understand. Technically, the president is the head of state. We do have a head of state, that is the Queen, but she doesn't really have powers. In Germany, the president does have powers, much more like, say, the president of France today, Emmanuel Macron, or if you were to go to America, and it's not, I guess, similar to the American president being like the most powerful person in government. So you have the president at the top, they're the head of state. They then choose the chancellor, and the chancellor chooses who's going to be in the cabinet. So I'm going to talk you through really briefly some of the powers that each different group has and what their role in the government is. I'm going to apologise now if I look down because I can't remember absolutely everything off the top of my head, and it's very important we get these things right. So, the first one, we have got the president. Now, they're the head of the Weimar Republic, as I said. They're the head of state. That means they're representative. And they're elected by the people every 7 years, which I've also written on there as well. They don't really do anything in the day-to-day running of the government, which I guess is like the Queen. They kind of oversee some of the bigger pictures, I guess the vision of what Germany is trying to achieve, that kind of thing. They had some important political powers, for example, the fact that they choose the Chancellor, and also there's one down here which I put as a weakness, Article 48. We'll come back to that in a sec. So the president's basically like somebody popular who can unite the people. He's going to represent the people. He ultimately is the head of the government. So the president has the right to choose the Chancellor, but to also dismiss the Chancellor, choose a different one. And they also have the right to call and dismiss the Parliament as well. Now, they choose the Chancellor. The Chancellor is a role that we'll be much more familiar with. The leader of the German government today is still called the Chancellor. That is still the role, that title they have. And the Chancellor is much more like a Prime Minister. They are involved in the day-to-day running of Germany, in drafting laws and things like that that are going to affect things like taxation and that kind of thing. The Chancellor is basically the head of the government in the Weimar Republic, and they choose all the government ministers. Those government ministers are the ones who sit in the cabinet. The Chancellor is kind of like the lead figure in the cabinet. So the cabinet will meet together to discuss, you know, what direction Germany's going in and kind of what new laws they want to put together. And the Chancellor will kind of lead those meetings and that kind of thing. The cabinet itself, those are the most important ministers. They work quite closely with the Chancellor, and they're the main decision-making body in the government. So they're the ones who sort of say, this is the kind of law we want to pursue. Then the Chancellor will propose it to the Reichstag, and the Reichstag will vote on whether the law that the cabinet and the Chancellor came up with is going to become a law or not. Then below that, we've got the Parliament, so the Reichstag and the Reichsrat. Now, I'm going to have to take a moment to explain the difference between these two. I already said the Reichstag is more important. It's the more powerful of the two houses. The Reichstag is the one that controls taxation. So they're the ones who kind of like vote through whether taxes will be raised and kind of keeps an eye on that kind of thing. They're directly elected by the people at least once every 4 years, whereas the Reichsrat, also elected once every 4 years. However, it kind of represents regional areas in Germany. So one of the things that's hard for us to understand, well, I guess one of the ways we could explain it, is Germany isn't united into one country until we get to, I think it's 1871. But before that, there are lots of different German kingdoms like Bavaria and Prussia and places like that. And it's not until 1871 that they kind of get united. So I guess the only comparison I could think of would be like in the UK, where you've got Scotland and Wales and England and Northern Ireland, and they're all separate, and they all kind of have, like Scotland has its own parliament and things like that. So I guess that's the only similarity I can find. The different regions in Germany don't have the same amount of autonomy or power that maybe Scotland does in the UK, but it's maybe helpful for understanding that regional thing. It's like a regional, where they're from. Okay, and then, yeah, we talked about the electorate. This system has a lot of strengths and weaknesses with it. So I'm going to talk you through those now really briefly. First strength is it is democratic. It means that the people get to choose and they can vote for who they want to be in power. They vote for the president. They vote for the parliament. It's a nice way for the Germans to actually have a say. Whereas under the Kaiser could kind of do what he wants. It was similar to a dictatorship. He could just make a rule and everyone had to do it. And now they can have a say. The problem with that is it's a bit too democratic. In some places in Germany, people who've never voted before are going to the polls on election day and they're having to choose from a list of, in some cases, it's something ridiculous, like maybe even 15 different parties who have slightly different views and things like that. Now, nowadays, when people go to elections in the UK, some people find it quite daunting to choose. Do I vote Conservative? Do I vote Labour, Liberal Democrat, Green Party? Whatever parties there are, it can sometimes be really hard to choose which one to vote for. Difference is Britain has had a more kind of democratic election system for a long time, so British people are quite used to it. In Germany, they've gone from having dictator, so never having a say, suddenly having a massive say, but being completely overwhelmed with the number of parties to choose from. They don't know who to choose, and it's quite daunting for a lot of German people. So although it's good that they can have a say, it's also a little bit kind of disconcerting for a lot of German people, and they don't know what this is going to mean for them. Second good thing is there's proportional representation. Now this is already a slightly longer video than I planned, but I'm going to take a minute to try and explain proportional representation to you. So proportional representation is where the number of votes that are counted and the number of seats that party gains in the parliament is kind of proportional. So for example, if, and I'll use UK parties for now to try and help you keep up. If the Conservative Party were to win 60% of the vote, so 60% of all the votes that happened were for the Conservatives, that would mean that they would get 60% of the seats. So 60% of the positions of, for us, Member of Parliament would be Conservative, because that's the number of people voted, that's the number of seats they get. And say if then Labour got 35% of the vote, they get 35% of the seats because they had 35% of the vote. That's what proportional representation is. In the UK, we have a different system. We have first past the post, which means that sometimes, even if a party has got like 65% of the vote, they might only get 50% of the seats, or they might get 80% of the seats, and it depends where they won the seats and things like that. Proportional representation means that all of the smaller parties that maybe are only going to get like 3% of the vote, who under a first past the post system probably wouldn't get a seat, they still get 3% of the seats. So it means that smaller parties are actually able to have a say in the government, which is good because it means it's more democratic, but is bad because it leads to coalition governments, which is where there isn't one party who has 50% of the seats or more in the parliament. And if a party doesn't have 50% or more, then it's going to be really difficult for them to just vote through laws and things like that. They'll have to start making deals with other parties to agree with them and that kind of thing. Or they'll have to form a coalition government, which is where two or more parties have to kind of group together to have enough seats to get anything done. But the problem with that is that if you have like two or more parties, those two parties are still different parties. They have different views on things. It's going to take longer to agree. So it's good because it's really democratic, but it's bad because it can make the government more unwieldy. It can make it more difficult to get things done because people disagree more and have to compromise more on things that are important to them. Another good thing though is it was designed to share out the power. So there's things called checks and balances, things to prevent the president or the chancellor or the parliament from becoming too powerful, to try and sort of share out the power between them, which is good. The problem is, if there's a crisis, this system is really weak because of coalition governments and all of that kind of thing. And it means that if a crisis kicks off, it's very difficult for this government to solve the problems. So what they end up resorting to is Article 48, which I mentioned earlier, which is basically where the president, who's right at the top, instead of getting the laws passed through the Reichstag, if nothing's happening, the president can pass laws by decree, which basically means the president says, this is now a law, and then that's accepted that it's a law. It's good because it means that if there is a crisis, things can still happen, but it's bad because it means that if there's a huge crisis in Germany and the government's not working, the president almost ends up like running it like a dictatorship without actually getting the people's vote. So the democracy that is so prized by the Weimar government kind of dies off a bit. Then we've got another, should I say this one? Yeah, another good one is that local government retained traditional powers. So in the UK, schools, healthcare, the law courts, all of that are run by our central government. In Germany, the local government, so the local regions like Bavaria and things that I mentioned earlier, they actually run their own schools, they run their own law courts and that kind of thing. That's good as well, because that means that actually the central government of the president and the chancellor and the cabinet don't get too powerful, but it also means that these areas of Germany have different traditions and different values, and some of them are Protestant, some of them are Catholic. And by having these local governments retain some of that power, it means that those kind of traditions and values aren't just steamrolled by a central government. It means people can still keep their culture. The last bad thing, last weakness, and this is one that's probably linked to stuff that we were talking about last time, is that the new system was born out of blood and violence. So this new system looks great. Everyone can have a say, all of that kind of thing. You might think it would be quite popular with the people, but there's a general feeling in Germany at the time that actually this system of government was set up against the people's will. It's not really what the people wanted, and there's this feeling that it was kind of pushed on them, and they don't really like it. They're not really sort of standing with it. They don't really feel it was the choice of the people. And this is for a couple of reasons. Firstly, during the German Revolution that I talked about last time, or I said last video, the government basically, in order to set up this new system with Prince Max, they relied on using force to suppress any opposition to what they were trying to do here. So that was firstly the bad one. The government is relying on force to make sure the people kind of do what they're told, and everything like that. And also to like subdue public riots. They've been using the army to do that. That's why Berlin is like kicking off big time, so they run away to Weimar. The other one is several parties are elected to the Reichstag, including groups like the Nationalists and the Communists, which I'll talk about in later videos. But those are parties who actively oppose democracy, and they despise this system. They hate it, and they're in the government. So that's the other danger of this, is that actually, because it's so democratic, you've got parties in the government who are actively trying to undermine and destroy this government from the very beginning. So I think that's the end of everything I have to say for this video. Sorry it's a bit longer than I intended, but that is kind of my overview of the Weimar government, the new system, how it worked, strengths, weaknesses, that kind of thing. If you do have any questions, feel free to write it in the comments, and I'll have a look and try and answer any of them, either in the comments or in another video. But good, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you next video. Bye!